Thanks for coming back for part 2 of moving cellular materials. Today, we are going to talk about the first way to get molecules across a cell membrane, and that is through passive transport. Passive transport is a term that describes any movement of substances across a cell membrane without the input of energy. When trying to imagine what transport that doesn't require energy might be like, my favorite metaphor is the experience of floating on an inner tube down a river. All you have to do is sit there, expending absolutely no energy, and still you get transported from one place to another, because the law of nature dictates that water flows downstream, and you will naturally go with it. So, molecules can move across membranes in much the same way, following their natural current and not using up any energy to get there. There are 3 types of passive transport that we will discuss tonight. Diffusion, which is pictured here on our cell membrane. I will write it in slowly. Okay, so this picture shows us diffusion. The molecules are moving straight through the membrane with no help from anything and no energy being used. The second type is osmosis, which is not shown on this slide, but we will illustrate it in 2 slides from now. And then finally, the third type is facilitated diffusion, which is shown here, which is going to take a little while for me to spell. Facilitated diffusion is represented in both of these pictures. And you can see that what makes these 2 pictures different than the first picture is that they are using the assistance of a transport protein, either a channel protein, like the first one you see there, or a carrier protein. To help the molecules across the membrane. All right, so that looks like a kindergartner wrote it. I apologize. All right, so I'll describe facilitated diffusion later in the PowerPoint as well. We'll begin by looking at the most basic type of passive transport, which is diffusion. Diffusion is a type of passive transport in which molecules move from areas where there are more of them to areas where there are fewer of them. In other words, from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. Let's take a look at the pictures, starting with the left. To understand how diffusion works, you first have to identify the direction of the concentration gradient. In this picture, there are more molecules outside the membrane than inside the membrane. So here we have a high concentration. Here there's a low concentration. This means that in the case of the first picture, the direction of the concentration gradient is, as this orange arrow shows, from high to low. So in this case, going from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. When diffusion occurs, molecules will move in the same direction as their concentration gradient. So in this case, I'm drawing a dashed arrow to show that the molecules will move in the same direction as their concentration gradient. Because this is diffusion and these molecules are small, they can actually pass straight through that cell membrane. This is the most natural way for molecules to move. Again, it is similar to the idea of going with the flow by floating down a river in the inner tube. It does not take any energy for these molecules to move in their natural direction with the concentration gradient. As we look at the second picture, we have to determine if a concentration gradient still exists. Here, it does still exist. There is a greater concentration of molecules outside than there are inside. So our molecule will continue to move from high to low. Okay, so these will continue to move in. Okay. As long as the concentration gradient exists, those molecules will continue to move into the cell. Eventually, as shown in the last picture, the molecules will reach a state in which they are equally spread on either side of the membrane or equally spread throughout a substance. This state of equality is called equilibrium. When equilibrium has been reached, there is no more net transfer of molecules through the membrane. Our next transport process is osmosis. Osmosis is the diffusion of one specific type of molecule, water, through the cell membrane. Just like other molecules, water can move either from the outside environment to the inside of the cell, or do the opposite. It can leave the inside of the cell and move to the outside. Whether water molecules will diffuse into or out of the cell depends on the concentration of solute molecules in the water surrounding the cell. The word solute refers to any other molecules that might be dissolved in the water. In the diagrams below, the red dots represent solute molecules. Okay, so you might want to even make a little key here. Okay, the red dots are solute. All right, so let's look at the first diagram. In this diagram, a plant cell is shown with a high concentration of solute inside the cell. Let's compare that to the third diagram, where the plant cell is shown with a high concentration of solute outside the cell. So, how does the solute concentration affect the way water will move? Please remember this rule, and you will have an easy time understanding the movement of water by osmosis. The rule is that water always moves towards areas of high solute concentration. So, in the first example, water will move into the cell from the outside because the solute concentration is much higher on the inside, and water will follow the high solute concentration. Sometimes as the water moves into a cell, the cell can actually expand. So I'm showing you here, the cell looks like it is even blown up a little bit because it's filling up with the water that is moving in by osmosis. On the other hand, if the solute concentration is higher outside of the cell than it is inside the cell, like in this third picture, the water will move out of the cytoplasm, out of the cell, and into the extracellular environment or the outside environment. When this happens, the cell can sometimes shrivel up and shrink because now it doesn't have enough water to keep its shape. Of course, if the solute concentrations are equal inside and outside the cell, then there's no total change in the amount of water leaving or entering the cell. So in this picture, water will enter and leave at the same rate, and the cell's volume and shape will remain stable. We will watch this video tomorrow, as well as the video on passive transport. All right, so we have learned that some molecules diffuse easily right through the cell membrane. The molecules that diffuse easily with no extra help are small molecules that do not have a charge. However, our cells need all types of molecules, and some of the most important molecules that our cells need are medium or larger in size, or sometimes they are molecules that carry a charge, like ions or polar molecules. These molecules need extra help to diffuse through the membrane, so they use a type of passive transport called facilitated diffusion. For those of you that take Spanish, you will recognize that the root of the word facilitated here, fácil, means easy. So, facilitated diffusion is the same thing as regular diffusion, only it is made a little bit easier for the molecules that may need some extra help. In facilitated diffusion, transport proteins located in the cell membrane act like doors or tunnels to let ions or large or medium size or polar molecules pass through the membrane to the other side. So, to finish, please make sure that you understand that this type of movement is still passive transport because it does not require energy to move the molecule with its concentration gradient. In this picture, you can see the higher concentration of solute is outside, the lower concentration of solute is inside. So, these solute molecules, let me get a better color here. These solute molecules, even though they can't go straight through the membrane, okay, they can't do that. Even though they need to use the help of a transport protein to get through, they're still moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Right? So it is still passive transport. All right, that's it for tonight. Do your Quizmodo, and I will see you tomorrow.